Phaedo is the longest of the selections that we're going to be going over here, and it ranges over a lot of different topics, focusing primarily on death and the immortality of the soul. It starts with Phaedo, who was actually present at Socrates' execution, recounting the story of everything that happened that day to Echecrates, a friend of his. The story starts as Socrates' friends are finally allowed into his room after he's been let out of his chains. They chat for a bit before Socrates mentions, rather offhandedly, that any who call themselves philosophers should be quite ready to die, even look forward to it, so long as they don't actually commit suicide, or as Socrates puts it, lay violent hands upon themselves. Someone asks Socrates what he means by that, and he says the reason behind not committing suicide is fairly simple. Since men are looked after by the gods, and by extension possessions of the gods, it would be just rude for a man to end his life before the gods willed it. The idea, however, that a philosopher should be so ready to die is a much more contentious claim, and most of the rest of the dialogue is geared towards its justification. Socrates explains it like this. He is happy at the prospect of death because he fully expects to join in the presence of the gods, and very likely the presence of other good men, all in all a better existence than life itself. Socrates strongly advocates for a suffering-free afterlife here, and his friends start to question him incessantly on why he's so certain of that. First, Socrates seeks to define death itself. The consensus he gets from those present is that death is separation of the soul from the body. Next, he gets agreement that a philosopher is someone who denies himself the pleasures of the body, that in fact a philosopher seeks to detach himself from his body as much as is possible and turn towards the soul, that a philosopher is someone who seeks not pleasures of the flesh, wealth, or riches, but ideals like virtue, justice, intelligence, and wisdom. Furthermore, if intelligence is a philosopher's goal, the body is a hindrance in every way it could possibly be. Its faulty senses deceive us at every turn, leaving us with only our reasoning to seek truth, and even when we try and spend time in thought, the body's baser needs and urges constantly get in the way. A philosopher is someone who seeks to separate himself from his body as much as is possible, so that he can grasp more of the truth. And given this, isn't death what a philosopher wishes for most of all? To be entirely free of the body and its limitations? Death, in fact, seems to be the only way to achieve intelligence in its purest form, without perceptual limitations or any other instincts getting in the way. Socrates shifts gears here for a moment and points out that for most men, the reason that they're able to face death with bravery is because they fear more what would happen if they ran from death. For instance, a soldier who faces down a horde of enemies to protect his family. He fears death no less than any other man, it's only that he fears the idea of losing his family even more. In that sense, the man is only brave through his greater fear. Just like a man who, addicted to drugs, throws all his energy into sports. He stops using drugs, but only by partaking in an excess of something else. He becomes temperate, but only through profligacy. Which is ridiculous. It makes much more sense to exchange these fears and vices not for more fears and vices, but for intelligence, that a man may gain real courage, real temperance. Anything else is just wasteful. That's all well and good, Socrates' friends say, provided that there's an afterlife at all. How do you know, they ask, that the soul even maintains its existence after it leaves the body? Socrates then goes over a couple of arguments that are designed to prove just that. The first proof, as it were, is based on the idea that everything comes into being through its opposite state. For instance, for something to come into the state of being big, it must necessarily at one point have been small, or at least smaller. If this is so, then for something to become dead, it must pass through the state of being alive, assuming that life and death are opposite states. Conversely, for something to come into the state of being alive, it must pass from the opposite state of death. Socrates further reasons that it must be a cyclical process, for if it were to proceed in a straight line, life to death with no way back, eventually everything would gather at the end, and the whole world would be dead. Now this theory doesn't completely satisfy everybody present, so Socrates offers up another idea, based on his theory of recollection, the idea that all learning is merely recollection, the remembering of things the soul once previously knew. The gist of recollection is that because people are able to comprehend abstract qualities that aren't actually observable in the real world, they must have previous knowledge of them. For instance, the fact that someone can see two sticks lying on the ground and recognize that while they're not exactly equal in length and other aspects, they come close. That is to say, the fact that somebody can recognize that two sticks defectively resemble a state of equality implies that the person has knowledge of equality itself. But equality doesn't actually exist in the real world. Everything that's observable is deficient in its resemblance to equality. But nonetheless, we have this idea of perfect equality in our mind. Socrates maintains that we had this knowledge before our birth, but that at the moment we came into this world, we lost all of it, requiring us to relearn everything through recollection. This implies that our souls must have existed before birth. For to lose something at the moment of birth, we had to have had it before, and to have knowledge of anything requires the soul itself to actually exist. Next, Socrates refutes a competing view on the nature of the soul, presented by Simmias, and to a lesser extent Cebes, who believe that the soul is a composite of parts, an attunement, as Socrates puts it. Now at this point, everyone in the room is utterly convinced on the theory of recollection, which Socrates states is incompatible with the idea of a soul as an attunement. This is because an attunement should be impossible if the component parts, i.e. the body, don't exist yet. Furthermore, an attunement necessarily follows from the function of its parts. It can't direct them. The metaphor that Socrates uses to explain this is that of a harp. The parts making up the harp, the wood and the strings, are like the parts of the body, with the attunement being the harp itself. The parts used to create the harp determine the shape, form, and quality of the harp itself. If this were the case with the body and its soul, then the soul would be incapable of opposing the body. But we see that this is not the case by looking at any philosopher, who strives to master his body and deny its urges. There's another major problem with the idea of an attuned soul. If we grant that no soul can be more or less a soul than any other, which Socrates and his friends do, and that virtues are yet another kind of attunement, which, again, everyone in the room assents to, then all souls should be equally virtuous. In fact, assuming that vice is the opposite of virtue, and therefore a non-attunement, vice shouldn't exist in any soul at all, but obviously this is not the case. Now, back to Socrates' theory on an immortal soul. He's established firmly with those present at this point that the soul exists even before and after death, but that's not enough. After all, if the soul itself can die later on, or after, say, 9 lives, life is still a whole lot more precious than Socrates is making it out to be. So Socrates sets out to prove that the soul is in fact undying, immortal. To do this, Socrates tells everyone present a story of his younger days, when he dabbled in natural science, looking for the cause of things coming into being and ceasing to exist. One day he stumbled across the writings of Anaxagoras and his theory of mind, and it caught his eye. What Socrates got out of it was that this entity called mind would arrange things in the way that was best for that particular thing. And you could then explain the cause of that thing by describing how it was best for that thing to be the way it was. Socrates was delighted by this idea, but as he read further, he realized that Anaxagoras didn't take this avenue of reasoning at all. He sets a few premises, sees what follows from them, keeping only what agrees with everything that he's admitted is true already. The premise that Socrates starts with is that there is such a thing as the beautiful, just, small, big, and the like. That is to say, there is an ideal form of these things, and others like it. Socrates reckons that with this he can finally explain the ultimate cause of things. Something would be big because it connects in some way to the ideal bigness, and something beautiful because it touches on the ideal beautiful. It may not be the most descriptive explanation, but Socrates is trying to work with as few assumptions as possible here. In summary, things only bear characteristics because they connect to the ideal forms these characteristics represent. Furthermore, these forms can never admit their opposites. That isn't to say that something that's tall can't become short and vice versa, but that tallness can never become shortness. For something tall to become short, that thing's tallness must either retreat or be destroyed. To illustrate this point, Socrates compares the height of himself, Simmias, and Phaedo. Socrates is the shortest, followed by Simmias in the middle, and Phaedo is the tallest. Now, Phaedo isn't the tallest because he's Phaedo, it's just that he has more tallness than either Socrates or Simmias, and less shortness. While Simmias has more tallness than Socrates, but less tallness and more shortness compared to Phaedo, and Socrates has more shortness than either. Simmias, then, is both tall and short, tall compared to Socrates' short, and short compared to Phaedo's tall. This is possible because Simmias is not dependent on the characteristics of tallness and shortness for his existence. He merely happens to connect to the forms of tall and short in a particular way. Socrates then gives another example, in this case comparing the characteristics of fire and ice, fire being hot and ice cold. Now in this case, both fire and ice are dependent on their connection to their respective forms of hotness and coldness, and cease to exist when that connection is severed. Bring coldness into fire, and the fire goes out. Heat into ice, and it melts. They will never admit their opposite characteristic, for they are defined by their connection to their respective forms. Using this idea of things that always bring along with it their respective forms, such as fire always bringing up with it hotness, Socrates has derived a more descriptive way of naming causes. A person's body is hot not because of heat, but fire, which brings heat along with it. And to explain why someone is sick, you don't say it's because he possesses sickness, but because he has a fever, which necessarily brings sickness along with it. Now, yes, these ideas don't make a whole lot of sense from a modern perspective, but you have to bear in mind the context and what these people knew about the body and how it functioned 2,000 years ago. Anyways, the conclusion to all of this is that, assuming everything we've said up until this point holds true, then the thing that brings along with it life when present in a body is soul. This means that life would then be a necessary characteristic of the soul, and that the soul can therefore never admit its opposite, which would be death. Now with this, everyone present with Socrates at the time is convinced of the deathlessness of the soul, but that still allows the soul to perish or retreat at the prospect of death, in the same way that fire retreats and perishes to oncoming cold. Deathlessness must also imply indestructibility, and though no formal argument is given for it, there is some justification, at least in the minds of the men present, in that if the form of life itself and all other deathless entities, i.e. the gods, are not indestructible, then nothing at all is. This proposition appears to be something that neither Socrates nor any of his companions are willing to venture. The idea that things like the gods could cease to exist would have seemed fairly ridiculous to them. Now, if we back up all the way to the beginning, we finally have a complete answer as to why philosophers should be ready to face death at any time. The prospect of the immortal, indestructible soul finally being freed from the fetters of the body is certainly something to look forward to. At this point, the formal discussion ends, and Socrates spends some time finishing up his affairs. He bathes, speaks to his family and children, and then, close to sundown, finally requests to be given the poison that will kill him. And as the poison starts to reach his heart, and Socrates is lying on his bed, he speaks his last words to Phaedo, and bids him to offer up a cock to Asclepios, the god of doctors and medicine, who typically received sacrifices when people recovered from sickness. The point being that, even with his last breath, Socrates once more affirmed that death was the cure to the limitations of the body.